In this exercise, we're going to convert the appearance of these checkboxes into switches. So we're going to customize the checkboxes so they're switches, they're going to have a little bit of animation on them, and they're definitely going to add quite a bit of polish to our web page. Before we jump into the checkboxes, we have just a few things to do on our page. I want to extend out the input and the text fields so they take up more of the available space. I also want to move the submit button so it's over here on the left at the large screen. Let's do that first. Let's go into our CSS and let's make adjustments to the input and the text field boxes first. I'm going to go into my CSS file where I have the form rules, and we'll go into our form input and form text area rule. Currently, we have no width defined for either of these items. We're going to go ahead and we're going to specify width so that we can ensure that the width of these items takes up more of the space that's available. I'm going to want the width to take up 100%. If I go ahead and specify 100% on the width and we refresh, you can see that the form elements are going to be spilling into what really is our second column. And the reason why is because we specified 100% and we're using padding on the right and the left of 12 pixels. Well, this is easy to remedy using the Calc function, which we talked about in an earlier movie. So I'm going to go ahead and use Calc. I'm going to say 100% minus 24 pixels. Now I should get results where the input and the text boxes fill the available area. That looks much better. It's a little too tight to the second column, but we'll make adjustments on this when we begin to style these items. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to move my submit button. The submit button currently is over here on the right because remember that we floated each of the form column divs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to need to put a clear on the submit button. Now, I already have a class of clear that clears both. I'm just currently not using it. So I'm going to go into my HTML, and on the div that contains the submit button, I'm going to add a class of clear it. When I save and refresh, you can now see the submit button is in the proper location. Let's move on to working with the checkboxes and switch them over to switches. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take these checkboxes and I'm going to scoot them away from the first column. We'll do that by adding some padding on the left. If we look into our index.html, the div that contains the checkboxes has the form column class and also a checks class. We'll use that as a hook. I'm going to make some new rules down here, and for our selector we'll use .checks space label and we'll add padding on the left of 60 pixels. If we save and refresh, you can now see that I have some spacing over here. The reason that we want this additional spacing is because we have to create room for the switches. So the switches are going to appear to the left of the text. Here's the final. I have to create some space for that. Now you can see that my select a stash also needs to be scooted over. So we're going to take the div that contains the checkboxes and we're going to adjust it as well. But remember, this is something that I only need to do at the large screen. At the small screen, I don't want to move this over to the left. So this is something that we'll have to put inside of our media query. I'm going to go down into my media query and we'll make a rule for .formCall.checks. Here we're going to add a margin on the left of 2 ems, and I'm going to use our same trick with the width and specify the calc function. I want this to be 50% at the large screen minus the 2 ems. If I save now and we refresh in the browser, you can see that now the whole div with the checks scoots over by 2 ems. This is responsive, so when I get to the smaller size screen, the H3 is not indented, and that's exactly what we want. So what I need to do is I need to have something that I can use to actually create the switches out of. For this, we're going to have to add something into our HTML. So if I go into my HTML and I look into the checks section of our page, you can see that we currently have a label tag. It wraps around the input field that has a type of checkbox. And I've already added a span tag that follows the input tag. I've added this to every single checkbox set The span tag is going to be the hook that we're going to use to create the switches out of. So after the input field, make sure that you add a span tag to each of these label sets. Now that I have those added, I'm going to go back into my CSS. We'll make a rule for label space span, and we're going to tell these span tags to display as inline blocks. I'm going to go ahead and give them a width value of 45 pixels and a height value of 20 pixels. We'll add a border radius of 14 pixels, and I'm going to create a border as well. The border is going to be solid, 2 pixels, and we'll use our RGBA color. I'm using the same green color that we used in the previous exercise. We're going to use a 0.5 or 50% opacity fill for this. If I save now and I refresh, you can start to see that the ovals are going to show up. We don't want them indented like this, so I'm going to use a position of absolute. In order to use the position of absolute, I have to be able to position them to something. That something is going to be the label field. Remember that the span tags exist inside of the label field. They are children of the label field. So we'll come back up to the rule that we already have for label, and I'm just going to use position of relative. Remember, this is like a switch to turn position on. It doesn't do anything by itself, but once we have it, we'll be able to position other children elements to that relative parent. Back in my label span, I'm going to use position of absolute. I'll go ahead and I'll set the top value to -1 pixel. I just need to pull it up a little bit, and the left value is going to be 0. If we save and look now, you can see that these are now positioned in a better location. The next thing that I'm going to put in this rule is I'm going to put a CSS3 transition property. The transition property is going to allow me to do some subtle animation. We're going to animate the background color, so I'm going to specify background color, and I want it to animate over half a second, so I'll put 0.5 seconds. Now we're going to create a little dot that appears inside these pill-shaped containers. We'll use our pseudo class selector to do that. I'm going to go ahead and make a selector of label space span : after. And for this, we'll create empty content. I'll also position these elements absolute. I'm going to give them a top value of 3 pixels and a left value of 5 pixels. I'm going to give them a width of 14 pixels and a height of 14 pixels as well. And we probably want these to display as block level elements. And in order to have them display as circles, I'm going to change the border radius to be 50%. This will ensure that they render out as circles. And then I'm going to set my background color, and I'll use a RGBA color with red of 99, green of 161, blue of 140, and 60% for the alpha. We're going to use the CSS transition property, and this time we're going to transition the left position, and we're going to have it happen in 5 seconds. So if we save now and refresh, you can see that I get little dots inside my pill shapes. Now in my HTML, I specified that the Fu Manchu stash type was checked. We're going to go ahead and we're going to make another style that's going to look slightly different if the checkbox is checked. The selector for this is going to be label input : checked plus span. The pseudo class that an input gets if it's in a checked state, that's what we're trying to target right now. So we're targeting the span element that appears immediately after that input field. So if the input field is checked, then we can target the span element. The rules that we're going to place on here are going to be border color, and we'll use the same RGBA color that we used up above in the span after for the background color. This is now going to become our border color. And then for the background color, we're going to specify a slightly lighter shade of green. Let's save and see what that looks like. You can see that my checked state is going to be dark like this. Now I also want to alter the position and the design of the little dot. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to make a selector for that after pseudo state as well. So my selector is going to be label input :checked plus span :after. This is targeting the little indicator dot itself. I'm going to use the left position, and I'll use my calc function again. I'm going to have 100% minus, and we're going to use 19 pixels. I'm getting the 19 pixels from the 14 pixel width plus the left position of 5, so that gives me 19. The reason that I'm using calc is that if I ever decide that I want to change the width of the container, I'm not going to have to go ahead and change the position of the indicator. We'll also specify a background color of being white. So if we save and refresh, you can now see that the checked state of my switch box looks quite a bit different from the regular state of the checkbox. We also have a nice little animation that's occurring when we click. So you can see when I click, the dot is going to animate back and forth. To get rid of this turquoise overlay when we click on our switches, we're going to need to add a rule of cursor default to the checks label. If I add that rule and refresh, you can see that when I click these, I no longer get that turquoise flash. So that's working much better. The next thing that I need to do is I need to hide the original checkboxes. So we'll go ahead and come in here, and for our selector, we're going to use label input. We're going to use an attribute selector of type equals checkbox, and we're just going to tell those to have a display of none. When I save now and refresh, you can see that those disappear. And now I have these wonderful switches that are custom made, and they really enhance my form quite a bit. This looks good at the large screen. Let's make sure everything's working well at the smaller screen. It seems to look pretty good here as well. So you can see with some CSS magic, we've changed the user experience of regular old checkboxes and made them into these custom switches that really go with the design of my page. We've also added some subtle animation that enhances the user experience. These sorts of little things will really make your forms stand out and improve the overall user experience.